Hello everyone and welcome back to TowerGate. It is TowerGate day number 1163, 1163. June the 16th, 2020, Tuesday. Thank you so much for tuning in and to my daily TowerGate video. And what is a TowerGate video, by the way? I know we have a lot of new subscribers over the past few weeks and months, so some of you may wonder how this all got started. So very briefly, I try to do this every now and again, just so you kind of know how this channel came about and what I'm trying to do here. Back on March the 6th of 2017, Trump tweeted out that he just learned that Obama had been tapping his wires. There was a couple of days went by where he was being brutally attacked in the media for making those claims. And of course, I thought, wow, you know, that's pretty wild for him to say that. I wonder if he's got any evidence of that, because if he doesn't, he's going to get beat up and he's going to have to walk this back. But after 2 or 3 days, Trump never walked it back. He just doubled down on it. And then, of course, within 1 day early, the following weekday, we had The Guardian write a story about GCHQ spying on behalf of the Obama administration on Trump. So at that point, I thought, wow, there must be something here. And so I decided I would do that I was going to follow the story. I thought, wow, if this is all true, it's bigger than Watergate. And I grew up during the Watergate period, remembered it very well, was always fascinated by it, read all the books on it, watched the movies, the whole 9 yards. And so I thought, wow, this could be the big political scandal of my lifetime that I can actually understand, because I was only like 10 years old at that time. So I thought, I'm going to follow the story. And my first thought was, okay, I'll do what I would do in the past, go down and get a spiral notepad and write down day by day what information came out. But I decided that, a lot of times there's so much to write because there's so much conversation involved, that the best thing to do maybe would be just to do a video. And I never actually thought anyone would ever watch the videos. So it was kind of, I kind of think about TowerGate as a daily diary. This is like my personal diary that I'm keeping following this TowerGate, Spygate, Russiagate, Obamagate, whatever name you want to give it. It's been given many names. But following this story about the spying on the Trump campaign and all the other things around it that we've learned since then. So this is really just a daily diary for me to do, and I do a video diary. And I just invite anyone who would like to come and watch. And if you're interested in following this story as I am, we will all follow this story together. And God willing, we'll get to the end of it someday, and justice will be served. So that's the bottom line. That's what TowerGate's all about. It's a daily diary of me following this story. Now, obviously, because some days there just isn't very much to talk about on the Spygate issue, there isn't much new news coming out, I've gotten kind of committed to doing these 30-minute videos, so I will talk about other subjects. But Spygate, Obamagate, whatever I'm going to call it, stories involving that will always be my top priority, because that's why the main purpose of my doing these videos. But in absence of information about that kind of stuff, I will talk about other issues as well that are going on. So that's the long and short of it. But anyway, welcome to my new subscribers. Thank you for tuning in. Welcome to the insanity. Welcome to the insanity. Alrighty, let's go ahead and talk about this story by John Solomon. I love John Solomon. I think he's one of the great reporters we have today. He reminds me of a throwback reporter, sort of an old gumshoe reporter, and that's why I like John Solomon. And of course, now he's got his own site called Just the News. I recommend that you check that site every day for new information on Spygate. Normally, if there's something new, it'll show up there. And so he wrote a story yesterday, basically the title being Why Durham is Examining the ICA, that's the Intelligence Community Assessment, and why it conflicts with one of its key conclusions. So anyway, you read through the article, and the only issue I have as I read through the article is that I'm not 100% on board with the narrative, and I'm not so sure John Solomon is. I think he's assuming the narrative, but I'm not 100% sure of this narrative. I'm very, very skeptical. And what I'm talking about is this narrative that came out after the Horowitz report was released, that the Russians had discovered in summer of 2016 that Christopher Steele was doing this opposition research, so they began to feed him Russian disinformation. So there's this theory that's been out there since the IG report came out that Russians were feeding Steele Russian disinformation. Now, I'm very, very skeptical of that. I still ask, as I do all the time, what Russians? There are no Russians. I haven't seen any Russians. If anybody else seen any Russians? So throughout this entire Russia hoax, we don't really find any Russians. And so consider me a major skeptic as to this whole theory that the Russians had discovered Christopher Steele was doing opposition research and decided to, feed him Russian disinformation. I don't really buy into that. Now, John Solomon, I don't know if he truly buys into that or if he's just working from the facts and evidence that's been in the Horowitz report and been widely reported other places, because this, of course, is something now that's pretty much been widely accepted. It's been widely reported, and John Solomon reports on it and talks about it as well. So keep that in mind when you're talking about this piece by John Solomon. He's assuming that this idea that the Russians were giving Steele disinformation is a legit point in his article. That's the only thing I would take issue with. I question that a great deal. He asserts it as if it's fact. I question it. John Solomon still pretty much believes that Steele was the primary author of the dossier. As most of you know, I do not believe that Christopher Steele was the primary author of the dossier. So there are some disconnects between Solomon and myself, but I still regard him as a great reporter and a guy who's legitimately trying to get to the truth. And he may be right, he may be wrong, I could be wrong, I could be right. We're not all going to get everything right. There's a lot of guesswork going on here until all the facts come out. But he does ask a very interesting question if you're working from the narrative, which is the point of the story. Why is John Durham so focused on the ICA and the intel community and that type of thing? So he asked the question here, if the Russians were intentionally feeding false dirt to Clinton about Trump, how could they be trying to help Trump? And this is exactly a point that I've made, regardless of whether you buy into this theory or not. The whole theory of the dossier. If the Russians are giving information to Christopher Steele, or anyone for that matter, in an effort, and we know the dossier is something that is harmful to Trump. The dossier makes these horrible claims about Trump and people in his campaign colluding with the Russians. I mean, why would the Russians implicate themselves in a plot with Trump, especially with no evidence to back it up? And why would they pass it off to the Democrats as opposition research? You see, none of these things make sense to me. It's not how the Russians have ever conducted themselves. Of course, the Russians are always running little operations against the U.S. They do it against a lot of countries, and we do it against the Russians and a lot of countries. All major countries have intelligence services, and they like to sow a little chaos with whoever. So this has been going on since the days of the Cold War. So I'm not dismissing the idea that the Russians get involved in some chaos spreading. We do it too. Everybody does it. That's not the issue. The issue is they've been trying to make the argument that Trump is colluding with the Russians, but yet we have which is what the dossier tries to tell us. Yet at the same time they're telling us that the source of all of that is Russians, but that they want Trump to win. I mean, none of it's logical, as I've been saying for 3 years now, ever since we learned about the dossier in January of 2017. I mean, none of it's logical. Yet I rarely hear anybody ever bring this up. When you just think about it for a second, the dossier is harmful to Trump. The dossier discusses how there is a plot going on between Trump and Russia, and that the sources of all this is Russians working for Putin. It doesn't make any sense. Why would Putin have his intelligence services plant this dossier or put this information, which will find its way in the dossier, which is designed to hurt Trump, if the entire point of the exercise, according to what we've been told in the official narrative, was for the Russians to help Trump. The dossier would hurt Trump, not help him. So if the Russians are trying to help Trump, why would they create a dossier that hurts Trump? And, more importantly, implicates them. It implicates them. If the Russians were behind this, they would be using Ukraine and the corrupt Ukrainians who overthrew Yanukovych. That's who the Russians would be framing in this dossier, not themselves. And if they wanted to help Trump, it would have been talking about the Clintons and the Democrats' collusion with the Western-backed Ukrainian corrupt people in Ukraine. That's what the Russians would have done. So he does make a good point by asking if the Russians were intentionally feeding false dirt to Clinton about Trump, how could they be trying to help Trump? Of course. It's one of the most basic logical things that you should arrive at, which I arrived at shortly after the dossier came out. And then they start saying, well, this is Trump working with the Russians. And this was back in January, February 2017. Here I am doing a YouTube video, this is well over 2 years ago, asking the same question. Wait a minute. If Trump's working with the Russians, that's what your dossier says, the dossier is negative on Trump. And it implicates the Russians along with him. Yet, so we're supposed to believe the Russians created a smear campaign against Trump, which implicates both Trump and the Russians, and in order to help Trump. It's mind-boggling. But yet this is the narrative that somehow has been allowed to go on and on and on. And there's another issue I brought up very early on after we learned about the dossier. And having been a bit of a student of the Cold War, I said on quite a few YouTube videos back a long time ago when we first started covering the story, I said, the way Russian intelligence would work, first of all, if in fact any of the information in the dossier were true, that information would be fantastic blackmail, like the PP-Gate story, for example. That would be fantastic blackmail material to have on a president. So what you would do if you're the Russians and you have that kind of blackmail material on an American president, you would hold on to it. And then once the president wins the election, then through various back channels, you would let the president know that you had this information and you would try to blackmail him with it. That's what you would do if you were the Russians. You would not go out and hand it off to some ex-British spy so that he could put it in a dossier to be used for a political opposition research campaign type project that you knew the purpose of which was to get it out into the media, right? I mean, the most important thing about having that information will be to use it against a sitting president. It's good blackmail material. Hey, guess what, Mr. President? Congratulations on your big win. Guess what we got on you? PP-Gate tape. The Russians would never, ever, ever have allowed that to get out. And if that information did exist and it was legit, that would be held within the closest inner circle of Putin, him and his inner circle of intelligence people and others. It would be a very small group of people who would have that information. And the Russians would make absolutely damn sure they account for everyone who knew about it. And they would keep a very close eye on them. And the first time any of that leaked to anyone, the Russians would grab everyone who knew about it and torture the hell out of them until they found out who leaked it. Because that would be very, very useful information to the Russian government. And if someone were to leak it, it's no good anymore. I mean, once it's out there, it's no good. So if in fact it truly was, that even if Russia did actually have that kind of damaging information on the president, they would have held that very, very closely. They never would have released it. They certainly wouldn't have given it to Christopher Steele to use for political opposition research. They would have held on to it until Trump won the election, then they would use it against him. And if someone leaked that type of very powerful information, Putin would track them down, figure out who did it, and he would have him probably dismembered alive. with like wrenches and shit. I mean, so there are so many ways that you can look at this that any reasonably intelligent person should have looked at this, from the very beginning and said, "Man, this is crazy stuff. This is either total BS, total garbage, or it's a political opposition research campaign. It's a campaign smear event. It's a typical October surprise smear campaign." And they should have laughed at it. The CIA should have laughed at it. The FBI should have laughed at it, but they didn't. They tried to make it something serious. They tried to use it for intelligence reasons. They tried to use it in fact, they did use it to launch investigations in the whole 9 yards, and we know everything about it. But when you look at the big picture, this is why this all looks so silly to John Durham. That's what John Durham's looking at. John Durham's looking at all this and going, wait a minute. None of this makes any sense. And there's no way that intelligence professionals, FBI professionals, would have ever bought this thing and believed it was legitimate. And that's because they didn't. And Durham knows that. So this is why, in my opinion, John Durham is so focused on the ICA and Brennan. Now, he also points out in the article that Brennan ignored intelligence community professionals' concerns that the Russians were split and that many wanted the Right Reverend Clinton to win because they would prefer the devil they know to the devil they don't know. And of course, this is exactly true. And so what Brennan is being taken to task for, and another reason why Durham is looking so hard at this, and this came out in an article written by Fred Fleitz about 2 months ago. He knows a lot of people in the intel community, and they were telling him, hey, we were telling the boss that we had just as much information, very compelling information, that the Russians, many of them in the Russian establishment, wanted Hillary, not Trump. But Brennan completely ignored it, overruled all of their information and evidence, and said, nope, not going to have any of that. It's going to be total there for Trump 100%. Now, anyone who remembers the 2016 election can remember that if you watch any RT, which I did occasionally watch some RT during the 2016 election, and you would see stories on RT, and you would see it on Sputnik. I mean, I would read stories in Sputnik. You would see it on Peter Lavelle's show, Crosstalk. You would see people coming on and talking about it, and it was open information, a clear open source information, that there were people in Russia who in the Russian government who would have preferred Hillary over Trump, and there were some who liked Trump, and there were some who like, because Trump said, hey, we'd like to have good relations with the Russians, whatever. But there was other people who didn't like the idea of what Trump was saying, because he was talking a lot about energy policy and wanting to make America number one in energy. And this is kind of a direct threat to the Russians, because they derive most of their income from energy, oil and natural gas. And if you have a president that wants to come in and dominate the world with oil and natural gas production, that is going to hurt the Russians' bottom line. So there were people on both sides in Russia throughout the summer of 2016. If you were reading any of the Russian press, not the Russian language newspapers, but RT Crosstalk, and various other shows, Sputnik and things like that, there were people on both sides in Russia, people who, and Putin really doesn't give a damn. As far as a guy like Putin is concerned, and the foreign policy people are concerned, they know that American foreign policy generally does not change from one president to the next. Regardless of what they say when they campaign, Putin understands, as the Russian government understands, that there is a ruling class, there's a ruling establishment that runs the show, and that the president is just a puppet who comes in for 4 or 8 years and gives fancy speeches and goes to fancy dinners. But ultimately, the deep state and the establishment run the show, and that's all it is. So the idea that Putin believed that Clinton or Trump were going to come in and drastically change the way U.S. foreign policy works, I think would I don't think Putin would entertain that even for a second. He understands how how things work in the American deep state or the British deep state or the French deep state. He understands there's a existing ruling class and an establishment, ruling establishment that determines most of these things. And the presidents are generally advised on everything they do by people that come from this ruling establishment. So again, you have to believe that these people in the FBI, the CIA, are as ignorant as they want all of us to actually be. Now, they want to make sure that we're really stupid, and they keep a lot of things from us so that we won't know these things, but they do know these things, okay? The FBI, the CIA knows everything I just said, okay, about how the Russians think and what the Russians do and behave and all that. Now, they know that, but their goal to continue doing what they do is to make sure the Americans largely stay very ignorant of the truth. They want Americans to believe that from one administration to the next, you could get a change or a shift in the way government does business, even though they know that the ruling establishment actually runs the show. But they want to keep the charade up. They want to keep Americans pretty much dumbed down in believing the bullshit. But most of us do not. If you follow my channel, you're probably one of the people who the light bulb went on a long time ago, and you know that this is all bullshit. So, among other things, Durham is also someone that understands all this. Durham understands how the Russians think. He knows that the Russians would never do anything like this or think in this way. Durham knows that the Russians would have had people who would have supported Hillary and some who would have supported Trump. Durham understands that the Russian government, particularly Putin, understands very well how the ruling establishment works. Durham certainly understands it. He knows Putin does. And so Durham's issue is why is the intelligence community and the FBI and others pretending to believe the bullshit? Durham knows that they don't believe the bullshit. He knows it's bullshit. He doesn't believe it. None of us believe it. And he knows that the FBI and CIA didn't believe it. Okay? That is why. So that's not what John Solomon says in his article. But I'm telling you, that is why Durham is really looking at the IC and the FBI. Because he knows that the FBI and the CIA were not so stupid that they believed any of the bullshit in the dossier. That they believed that there was any effort by the Russians to help Trump and hurt Hillary. Because it doesn't make a difference. I mean, he knows all that. This is why he's really looking at all these players. Particularly Brennan, the intelligence community, the FBI, and all these people. Durham knows that these people are not that stupid. The fact that they tried to push all this stuff onto us through the media and through the Clinton campaign and through leaks and all sorts of things, that was for our consumption. For us to believe it. For us to bite on it. Not for them. They're the ones pushing it. You think Brennan actually believed any of that shit? And of course, then we have Fred Fleitz comes out and writes the article, and of course he was in that intelligence community, and he says, hey, I know a lot of these guys, and I'm talking to them. He writes that article and says, hey, they're telling me that they were telling Brennan that, no, we actually have stronger evidence that suggests many of people around Putin and in the Russian government and in the Duma, they would actually prefer Hillary over Trump. So there's many reasons why Durham is focused on the ICA, the intelligence community in general, the FBI, throughout this investigation. It's because, you know, we get lots of facts and lots of documents and lots of witness testimony and lots of this and lots of that. But when you're a prosecutor investigating a very, very large conspiracy, the very first thing you have to do is get an accurate picture of the big picture. Okay, so what is the big picture? And then once you can see the big picture, then you start, you know, narrowing in on the small details. So I think when Durham came into this investigation, just like Attorney General Barr, they understood some very basic, simple things. That there's no way that the Russians would have been involved in something like this. If they did have this information, they certainly wouldn't have given it to Christopher Steele and handled it the way they did. They would have held on to it. That there would have been varying differences of opinion as to whether or not Trump or Clinton would be better, but you generally go with the devil you know than the devil you don't know. Durham and Barr would have understood very clearly once they saw some of the evidence that was supposedly used to get FISA warrants and launch investigations, Crossfire Hurricane, Papagalopoulos having this conversation with Downer and all this kind of stuff. Barr and Durham, from the very beginning, came into this and looked at the big picture and said, none of this stuff adds up. None of it. So what we're going to do is we're going to get into it and figure out exactly who was playing the shenanigans. Because that's all this is a bunch of shenanigans. And that's why Barr and Durham are digging into this. That's why. Now, with the remaining minutes, I just want to bring up something that I think probably a lot of people need to hear, if not from me, from someone else. But if you haven't heard from someone else, you need to hear it from me. And that is, all these things that are going on right now in the country are going to have a negative blowback effect on the perpetrators. And I think we have a pretty good idea who's behind all this chaos. I think that there are, I guess I would say forces, let's use that word, forces, largely dominated by people like Obama and Soros and all their various groups, who are largely behind the chaos and everything that's happening. Now, the average American doesn't know that. They just look on their TV and see the chaos, the rioting, the looting, and all this. But mostly what they're feeling right about now is that they're feeling like, if you're a white person right now, you're feeling like, like you're being blamed for slavery, the plight of the black man, all the bad things that happen. It's all because of Whitey. And I think that what we should keep in mind here is that a lot of people are afraid to speak up. They're afraid to talk. I mean, they're afraid to go to work and say anything about how they feel, especially if they're white. And a lot of blacks feel this way as well. And certainly Asians, let's not forget those people. And you have other groups, Hispanics. I mean, where are they in this conversation? Everybody is feeling kind of like they're being targeted. And what makes this kind of surreal is that the group that's targeting all this is a certain percentage of 13% of the country. Keep in mind, only about 13% of the country is African American, black. And probably only about half of those, if that, actually buy in to all this this racial hatred being directed at whites. And why they want us to apologize and start talking about reparations, and why they want to think that we should have guilt because we're white. We should feel guilt. We should feel shame. And a lot of people cannot talk about this, but you just know, I'm telling you, that this is what's in a lot of people's minds. A lot of white people, possibly Asian people, Hispanic people, and even some blacks are quite aware of what the game is here. And that is why it's going to blow back. It's very simple. When the 13% try to run a guilt trip on the 87%, it generally isn't going to work out very well, because the largest majority of the 87% are not going to buy into it, because they know that they get up every day and just live their lives. The overwhelming majority, in the 98% range probably, of white people get up in the morning and just take care of their business. They do not get up in the morning and go, gee, what can I do today to screw with some black guy? What can I do today to hold some black guy down? What can I do to mess with these people? That's not how it works, and most people know that. So what you have going on right now is a very, very large silent majority that is now being targeted. And they know this. They can feel it. And they're afraid to speak out because they're afraid of what might happen to them if they do, because they're seeing what's happening to other people who try to speak out and say, hey, wait a minute, I think the flag is a wonderful thing. We should respect our flag. Well, guess what? You might get fired because you said that. You might be doxxed. You might have your house vandalized. You might even be assaulted because you came out and said, hey, I think the American flag is a wonderful thing. I think we should all be patriotic. I think we should talk through all these things. No. That's not tolerated. The only position you have right now that they want you The only thing they want to hear from a white person right now is apologies. They want to hear you talk about your guilt and all these sorts of things. And I'm just telling you that the overwhelming majority of whites in the country, who make up about 87% of the country, are not buying into it. They have to keep their mouth shut for now. But they are going to get a chance to exercise their feelings here in about 5 months at the ballot box. And not just presidential election, congressional races, but look for those local races. Town councils, mayors, city managers, sheriffs, and even governors, state senators, state congresspeople. People are really paying close attention to this. This is not your normal situation. Most people in the country don't even pay attention to politics, the left and right, back and forth. They don't even pay attention. Half the people in the country don't even vote. They don't care. But when you have things going on that are going on like you see right now, where now it does affect them, now it does get their attention because they're looking at, wow, that could be my business burning. That could be my neighborhood burning. And if someone doesn't stop this, maybe it will be my neighborhood burning. How do I know? and is it got to the point where me, as a white person, I cannot go out and pledge allegiance to the flag, or say I love my country, or say I respect the flag, or say I support the troops, or say I think the police on large do a pretty good job. A few bad apples, but for the most part they have a very, very tough job, and for the most part they do a pretty good job. Rational, normal, reasonable people are having these feelings, and they're going to get their outlet here in about 5 months. But right now, it is pretty dangerous for a person to come out and say what they actually think. But if you want to get an idea as to whether or not people across the country, particularly whites, who, remember, make up about 87% of the country, blacks making up about 13%. Now, in that white, you're going to have some Asians. You're going to have Hispanics in that number as well. But black Americans make up about 13% of the country. The other 87% would be white, Hispanic, Caucasian. So it's probably about 70% white, about 12% Hispanic, and then you got a couple percent of Asians. But for the most part, non-black is what I'm talking about. If you want to get an idea of whether or not people are paying attention, you just need to know that this past Sunday on Trump's birthday, he raised $14 million in one day. $14 million in one day. My friends, that is a huge haul in one day. $14 million. And what do those $14 million represent? They represent the way a lot of people are feeling right now. People can't talk right now with their mouths without fear of, getting injured in some way. So they're speaking with their dollars. And in 5 months, they're going to speak with their votes. Pay very careful attention to what's coming. One last thing. Now we understand a little bit more about the mayor up there in Washington, in Seattle. It's Jenny Durkan. We now learn from a deep dive done on her. I don't know who did it. It was Technofog or Undercover Huber or somebody. It's on both of their Twitter feeds. But we now know that Jenny Durkan has deep ties to the Council on American Islam Relations, also known as CARE. And of course, we know that they are very, very closely affiliated with multiple terrorist groups, including Hamas and the Hamas groups over in the United Arab Emirates. We know that she is closely associated with Jenny Durkan, Linda Sarsour, and we know all about her. And so if you find this story over on Undercover Huber or Technofog and read the links and read all that's there, and you start to see all the ties that Jenny Durkan has to these communist, anti-American, in fact, Muslim terrorist groups, you will understand why what you're seeing in Seattle is actually going on. It all makes sense now. We know who Jenny Durkan is now. And she's not a patriotic American by any stretch. Thank you so much for tuning in. I'll be back tomorrow with more TowerGate. See ya. Bye.